When did the BBC find out about these allegations against Huw Edwards? And does it matter? Because I think it matters, and I think you will think it matters. In fact, I think it will make you angry. Stay tuned. So the BBC released a statement on Huw Edwards, which in and of itself is unusual because in its own article it's refused to provide a comment to itself, which was a bit strange. But here we are with a comment, a statement, in fact, from the BBC on Huw Edwards. This was published yesterday in regards, obviously, to the court appearance, and the BBC says as follows. The BBC is shocked to hear the details which have emerged in court today. There can be no place for such abhorrent behaviour, and our thoughts are with all those affected. The police have confirmed that the charges are not connected to the original complaint raised with the BBC in the summer last year, 2023. Nevertheless, in the interest of transparency, we think it important to set out some points about the events of last year. Now, in other words, this is setting out things that you probably didn't know, and whilst TV licence fee payers are essentially, for the most part, funding the BBC, which in turn is something else that I'll come back to in a moment, which again might upset you a little, for which I apologise. The BBC says as follows. In November 2023, whilst Mr. Edwards was suspended, the BBC, as his employer at the time, was made aware in confidence that he'd been arrested on suspicion of serious offences and released on bail, whilst the police continued their investigation. At the time, no charges had been brought against Mr. Edwards, and the BBC had also been made aware of significant risk to his health. Now, just to be clear for a moment there, if an employer is made aware of serious allegations, first of all, they don't need to wait for the outcome of any trial, if there is one, if charges are brought. They can follow their own investigations and disciplinary action in the meantime. Or they can just wait and see what happens. Most employment contracts, and I presume at the BBC, I've never read it, but I presume there is a morality clause in BBC employment contracts that says if you bring the organisation into disrepute, then that can be grounds for gross misconduct, particularly when they're of a certain nature. Now, at this point, I will just break away from the BBC statement for a moment, just to let you know that up until he resigned in April of this year, he was paid something up in the region of £480,000 a year, despite only being on air for a few months of that year that he was paid. Bearing in mind this court appearance was yesterday in July. Back to the BBC statement. It says, today we've learnt of the conclusion of the police process in the details as presented to the court. If at any point during the period Mr. Edwards is employed by the BBC had been charged, the BBC had determined that it would act immediately and dismiss him. In the end, at the point of charge, he was no longer an employee of the BBC because he'd resigned. During this period, in the usual way, the BBC has kept its corporate management of these issues separate from its independent editorial functions. We want to reiterate our shock that Mr. Edwards' actions, and our thoughts remain with all those affected. Now, this statement may come back in future discussions, depending on what, if anything, the BBC says going forwards, and if indeed they answer any questions moving forward, because there are indeed several questions that should really be asked and answered here. Jeremy Vine said that the BBC bosses should confirm if they tried to establish whether he was guilty of any of these crimes when he was first accused or the first suspicion was first raised of these serious offences back in November. Now, bearing in mind that the BBC knew about the arrest in November and continued to employ him until he resigned on medical advice in April. Jeremy Vine, as quoted in the Daily Mail, averred that the BBC would not be able to justify paying Huw Edwards' salary while he was suspended if he had admitted these crimes to them. Now, bearing in mind, again, that he was charged on 3 counts and he was paid something between £475,000 and £480,000 for the year 2023 to 2024, according to the BBC's latest annual reports. Now, Piers Morgan also raised this in a fairly pointed 8-word question in response to a post by Victoria Derbyshire, who said the BBC knew Huw Edwards had been arrested in November. Piers Morgan says, So why did the BBC not report it? Now, I think that's a good question. Now, the only reason I can think of that the BBC did not report it is that they were told in confidence and that they did not want to jeopardize any kind of investigation. But the point of all this is as follows. A significant portion of the BBC funding comes from BBC licence fee payers, many of whom do not even watch any BBC programmes. They simply watch or record any other live TV program on any device, on any channel, from anywhere in the world. You could be watching a live TV broadcast on an old console in your house somewhere that is broadcast from India or anywhere else. You still have to pay the TV license fee, which contributes to the funding of the BBC. And given that the BBC is a British public broadcast service whose responsibility is to provide impartial public broadcasting throughout the UK, many people might be justifiably upset that £480,000 of that money has been paid to somebody who's only worked a few months of the year and ended their career ultimately in disgrace for something that the BBC ultimately knew about many months before this court date. Now, there's a lot more to be said about the TV license prosecutions, which does frustrate me, and I want to tell you about that. But first of all, a short break with a fantastic partner of my channel. Okay, just for a moment, I'd like to get personal with you. Come here. Now, some of you know that I share personal stories on this channel, and some time ago I shared a personal story, I think this was over on Secrets, that we stopped drinking entirely, as in alcohol. We stopped drinking alcohol entirely. That's about 10 months ago now. And when I did that and did videos about that and talked about that, a company reached out to me called Wholly. Now, that was because I said I was getting bored of what I was drinking in the evening, and they had the perfect solution, which is naturally flavored water. So allow me to talk to you a little bit about this, because since we stopped drinking, I've noticed my sleep's improved, my energy's improved, and I generally feel better. Not that I drank excessively, I would never get drunk, and I would only have 1 or 2 drinks, but almost every evening. So I decided to cut that out completely. I'm kind of an all-or-nothing kind of guy. You've probably gathered that by now. And so Wholly reached out to me with a range of energy drinks, hydration drinks, and iced teas, which are good for you and good for the planet, and they promised they would taste great, and indeed they did. Full of high-quality ingredients, which I researched before agreeing to talk about them, and then give them a try. I even took them on holiday with me for something enjoyable to drink, so I wasn't tempted by wine or cider. My favourite drink, which I've reordered, is the strawberry and kiwi, which is fantastically tangy and refreshing, and I drink it by the gallon. But the new flavours to try today are the coconut and pineapple, so let's give them a go. So here's the coconut one, which should be very interesting because I don't think I've ever had a coconut flavoured drink, apart from the water out of a coconut, which I drink because I'm weird like that. Let's give this one a go. That really tastes like coconut. That's really refreshing, genuinely refreshing. What I love about these drinks is that they are genuinely really refreshing, especially the kiwi and the strawberry. But there's also a pineapple one. We're really getting into the spirit of summer here. Let's try pineapple. Now that's refreshing. It's not quite as pineapple-y as I might have expected. You know, when you eat pineapple, there's a very strong pineapple flavor, sort of really sharp. I don't know if it's because of how much water I put in here or what, but it is a pineapple flavor, but it's not as sharp as the normal pineapple flavor would be. So I suppose that's so that you can drink more of it without it becoming overpowering. I think if it was really any stronger, it would probably become overpowering. But otherwise, that's quite nice. But I think I do come back to my favorite as the strawberry and kiwi. That's really tangy, really refreshing. And it keeps you coming back for more because drinking more water is really a great habit to build. It takes time to build a habit, and water can be boring, especially like me, if you've given up drinking alcohol. I even gave up drinking soft fizzy drinks because I just didn't want to keep drinking fizzy drinks. Of course, I've got you a discount for partnering with Wholly for my channel. You can use the code Barrister5 for a £5 discount off your first order. and then just use Barrister for 10% off a larger order or every order thereafter. I would probably recommend you go with one of their starter packs so you get the shaker and a variety of the drinks to try, either in the energy or the hydration or the tea range, and see how you go. And then, like me, reorder the ones that you really like the most. So I share my story and these products with you because I genuinely use them myself, and that's my promise to you. I would never recommend something to you that I wouldn't use myself. They are genuinely fantastic. Cheers, Holy. Now, back to the TV license prosecutions. Now, many people ignore these prosecutions and ultimately will end up being found guilty in court without ever having attended. That is by the single justice procedure, which happens if you don't respond to the notice of intention to prosecute you. Now, it's the numbers that are staggering and utterly ridiculous for this offence, which, based on some recent statistics, over 47,000 people were prosecuted in a single year, and over 44,000 were convicted of this offence, being given fines of up to £1,000. Non-payment of the fine, by the way, is a separate offence. Now, this makes this one of the most common crimes in the country, other than motoring offences, and this puts it at a prosecution rate at well over 90%. But why is it that so many people are prosecuted, and why is it so many people are convicted? And why is it that on the statistics that are given by the Ministry of Justice, over 75% of those convicted are women? There's even been reports and investigations and recommendations as to why women are disproportionately represented in the prosecution and conviction statistics, and what they should do about it. Now, one of the big problems with this is that if you ignore all of the threats to prosecute you, then in all likelihood, you'll be found guilty in your absence by the single justice procedure, without anyone ever having heard a word that you had to say. For example, a simple defence might be, yes, I was using BBC iPlayer, but only for S4C, for which I don't need a TV licence to watch. It is only BBC programmes provided on BBC iPlayer, not, as many of the letters say, everything, and I quote, everything on BBC iPlayer. That is factually not true, and in my view, extremely misleading. Many of these letters, as I've been through in several videos before, say that you need a TV license to watch any live broadcast on any service, including YouTube, which is simply not true, because many people, including myself, have done live broadcasts on YouTube. I am not a TV channel. I am not a TV broadcaster. You do not need a TV license to watch any of my live broadcasts, nor the live broadcast of most YouTube creators out there. It would only be any live broadcast from a recognized TV broadcaster. But that's where it gets even worse, because when I asked the TV license office, the press office, for a definitive list of which companies by whom these programs you should have a TV license to watch, they couldn't provide me with a list. They just said most YouTube creators won't fall into that category, which I suppose is something of an answer. But these lines do get fairly blurred, and that is not an acceptable situation for a criminal offence. And so the reason that I go through all of that is that those that are paying the TV licence fee, which in turn is helping to fund the BBC, one might expect as a public broadcaster that is supposed to be impartial, one might expect all of the truth from this broadcaster. So at the very least, I agree with Jeremy Vine in that this is a very pertinent question that should be asked and should be answered. There's no reason it shouldn't be asked, and it shouldn't be answered now, at least now that the trial has been concluded, because there is nothing left to jeopardize. Now, whilst this video is not a character assassination on Mr. Edwards for what's happened, he has pleaded guilty to this offence, and the BBC should now really answer the question whether they knew about this at the time in November. Or at the very least, as Jeremy Vine suggested, whether or not they asked that question. Because if they did ask the question, and he said, no, I'm not guilty, only to then admit guilt more than half a year later, after taking hundreds of thousands of pounds, I presume, of money from the BBC in his salary until he resigned in April, then much of that money should really be coming back to the BBC as a public broadcaster, and ultimately much of it public money. Let me know in the comments if you agree. This is not to encourage a pile-on or a character assassination of any sorts. It is a public discussion of a public interest with ultimately a public body. It's a public corporation. The BBC is a public broadcast corporation which has a duty to be impartial, because I, for one, agree with those that have raised these questions, that those questions need to be asked and answered. So as I said, let me know politely, please, what you think in the comment section below. Make sure you check out Wholly. The link's in the description below. It's a fantastic product. I love working with them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.